if his shoulders are really flexible, you know, if I'm leaning forward, he's finally tapping. I can dive under his arm, get a gable grip, lean forward, and he's tapping. These are all perfectly viable, but there's people that I train with, and I know you train with people that have really flexible shoulders, and you think, I can't finish an omoplata on him because his shoulder's way too flexible. Okay, today we're going to look at omoplata and we're going to look at a kimura. Obviously both those are the similar techniques. You know, many people have issues finishing an omoplata and they assume it's because their opponent has really flexible shoulders. And although people's flexibility does change, obviously with age or, you know, how much you work out, maybe too many bench press. But flexibility in somebody's shoulder is not necessarily the reason that you can't finish an omoplata or kimura. And this comes down to the basics of joint locks. Taking a look at a joint lock, how a joint lock works, even though we're going to talk about omoplata, joint locks work by compound torque. So, you know, I've studied Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, I've studied Aikido, I've studied Judo, and, you know, currently Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or more specifically Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. But a joint lock is a joint lock. You know, the elbow can only bend one way, the wrist doesn't like to bend past a certain point, the shoulder the same thing, but the notion of compound torque is what makes the submission easier to accomplish versus not. And a simple one, I could look at his wrist here. So if, you know, Dan gives me his wrist, we know that if I turn it to the side, there's a point where he doesn't like it. We know that if I push it forward, there's a point where he doesn't like it. If I push forward and turn, it becomes compound torque. The same is true for extending. If I pull it out and turn, I'm doing compound torque. If I turn it to the inside, there's a point, you know, he has a lot of mobility, but there's a point where he can't stand it. If his hand's turned over and I bend it this direction, there's a point where, you know, the tension's too high. But again, doing a compound torque, turning it over and bending, you know, this is a typical Aikido lock. I turn the wrist over, but it's not just that I'm twisting it, I'm doing compound. I'm turning and bending down. And this is a, you know, very painful lock if you haven't seen it. But the principle of compound torque is what makes any joint lock more efficient than another. So we're going to look at it with an omoplata and identify how torquing a shoulder, right? So if I look at his shoulder joint, a lot of people believe that you have to have the hand pushed way over here. You can do it with the hand out here as well. But how are we going to add compound torque to this joint? And we're going to look at basically pulling the joint to an extension as it rotates over, right? So omoplata or a kimura, lifting the shoulder with the hand behind is one, but how do we add tension by pulling the shoulder, almost like we're pulling the shoulder out of its socket while we're doing the technique. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so now we're going to look at omoplata with compound torque, and we'll see how we can make it tighter where the submission happens almost instantaneously, and it's not necessarily due to your opponent's shoulder flexibility, it's that we're properly applying compound torque on the joint. So regular omoplata position without my body being here, my opponent's arm is on the ground, they're converted forward, I'm preventing them from rolling. Many people can take this bent arm torque a lot. I'm pushing, waiting on him to tap. He's finally tapping. Compound torque in this instance would be that I'm going to pull his shoulder joint. I'm trying to pull it away from his body. You could think you're trying to rip his shoulder joint out of socket. But as I pull it tight, there's very limited range of motion. So now as I begin the torque, he's tapping much quicker. Obviously, his body is trying to escape because it's so tight. So let's get into the regular position and see how we apply that. So if I'm coming into an omoplata and I tuck the wrist into my hip, kick up, I'm still close to him. I don't want him to escape. But this is not enough being tight. Many people modify this. They'll reach under, try to get a gable grip, and I'm leaning, and I know I'm going to get there. He's finally tapping, but that's way too much movement. The compound torque in this situation would be that I'm using my legs and my hip to pull his shoulder so tight, literally like I'm trying to pull it out of socket, which creates limited mobility. And then when I turn the vertical torque, there's so little movement that he has to tap instantaneously. So assuming I just sat up into omoplata, I'm dragging my feet out. You can see his hand, he's ready to tap, and I'm not even doing the torque yet. I'm just pulling this shoulder really tight. And then from here, as soon as I start to lean forward, it's over. So again, the difference between having this tight against his body and rising versus pull his shoulder out of socket and rise, it's instantaneous. And that's a proper omoplata with compound torque. Okay, so we're going to look at a Kimura from guard, which is the same technique as an omoplata, right? It's the same finish, but we're going to apply compound torque. There's an added benefit in the way that I do my Kimura, because I hate when somebody grabs their pants and tries to stall the technique. So standard Kimura, I'm reaching up, I'm grabbing the wrist, I come under, grab my own wrist, I scoot out, foot's on the back. I want his arm, before you grab, I want his arm to tuck behind here, but as we saw with the omoplata, many people can endure a certain amount of torque here. Eventually he's going to tap. There's a tap. But the problem with getting to this position is that they'll grab my pants, they'll grab their pants, they'll tuck their leg, and yes, there are many ways to break this and convert to different submissions. But I just want to look at compound torque again. How can I create tension on the shoulder by pulling it out while at the same time creating this torque? Because it's not necessarily my opponent's shoulder flexibility, it's that I'm not applying correct torque in multiple directions. So an added benefit of the way that I do this Kimura, I never sit in and try to turn in this direction because he immediately wants to fight and grab pants or grab something. So when I pop into my Kimura, I actually grab, and my first thought is to create a pull on his shoulder joint. And I'm using thumb here, I'm not doing monkey grip on mine. I'm using my thumb, and when I sit up, I actually grab, but I push, I'm extending so far away. And as he tries to pull back in, it creates even more tension on the shoulder joint. I'm trying to pull it out of socket. He can feel kind of a sweep or something coming, so he's going to sit back and pull. That's just helping me. He's creating more tension. And as I raise my shoulder to turn, the torque is immediate, just like the omoplata. So one more time. I sit in, I extend out. I'm using my legs as a brace. I'm pulling his shoulder. He's trying to pull away. It's already tight, right? And as soon as I start turning, it's the same thing. It is a Kimura. This is the motion that's happening. The shoulder is turning this direction. I'm just trying to pull it out of socket beforehand. So one last look. Dive over, extend, try to rip that shoulder right out of the socket, and then start turning. And there's the omoplata. Obviously I could finish, and that's the Kimura. I could obviously finish after I get this torque by now bringing it back to his back, but the whole goal is to try to pull this shoulder so tight that there's limited movement, and then the rest of the technique is instantaneous. And that's a proper Kimura.
Wow.